on which thy blessed Lord, let us come mighty on lateral to him, our Father, markable. Ashes, ashes, dust to dust, so let we in God we trust.
Welcome to A Time of Monsters. This is a podcast about our descent into barbarism and the radical left struggle against it. I'm Aaron. Today, our guest is Sean KB, co-host of the Antifada. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx wrote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." But what does this mean? Simply put, the material basis of all society is defined by how people interact with nature in order to produce things. This ever-changing process creates new needs, modes of economic production, and social relations. Marx also believed that political, legal, and cultural institutions arose from, but also reacted on, how we organize ourselves to make stuff. His attempt at understanding history by analyzing underlying structures came to be known as historical materialism. Capitalism, however, has obscured this history from the working class, engendering hyper-individualism and alienation in laborers throughout the world. As we slide into barbarism and ecological collapse, reclaiming this history is critical if we ever hope to create a better future. In this episode, Sean and I take a deep dive into historical materialism, which, as British Marxist Perry Anderson said, gives us the means with which to exercise a real, popular self-determination for the first time in history. If you like this interview and want to support us, go to patreon.com/AdamPod and become a patron for exclusive content, including weekly news updates. All right, here's Sean KB. Enjoy. This is the first episode. I'm not usually going to do introductions like this, but I kind of wanted to talk with you, Sean, a little bit about why I want to start this and kind of get your feedback, because I feel like as communists, this is something that's just felt at the nitty gritty, you know, to your bone. You kind of feel this way about the world. And ever since I was a kid, I was obsessed with dystopian and apocalyptic books and movies and shit. And I've always kind of felt that, I guess, the seeds of destruction were within our society, you know? And when I became a communist, a Marxist, I found out that that was actually true, you know?
Objectively true.
It's objectively true, right? So I want to start out by just talking about historical materialism with you. And as you are a dedicated Marxist, one who actually reads.
Yeah, it's a rare skill to have these days, but I'm fortunate to not even just read individually, but have a lot of good people who I study deeply with for many, many years in like outside reading groups and stuff like that. So I'm fortunate to really have such a good group of, a good collective around me who's been really good about learning together. And I do what I can.
Yeah. And I mean, that's why I wanted to have you on, man. And, you're going to be the first person to have on because listening to your show, The Antifada, and, of course, Chapo, but other podcasts like Revolutionary Left Radio.
Friends of the show, yeah.
Yeah, friends of the show. Hopefully soon. Trillbillies, definitely friends of the show. I had this sort of community of people that I didn't even know, but that felt like my friends, but also like kind of teachers, or just comrades, right? Not even necessarily teachers, but people I could learn with. And, I figured, yeah, you would be one of the best people to have on first, man, to kind of have that dynamic with. So I guess this is the best way to start off is you can view history in several different ways, right? We're going to talk about the correct way you should view history, or I would say the most advantageous to any goal of building like a socialist communist society. But talk about some theories of history that people are misled to believe are true.
I did teach for some years. Before I got into the trades myself, I taught U.S. history and Chinese history to apprentices in the building trades who were, unfortunately for them, forced to sit through lectures and read history and talk about history. And I think maybe the thing that I ran into the most often was the inability with the general sort of historical knowledge we have floating around from high school or the History Channel or what our parents and relatives tell us about what happened in the past is a deep inability to understand things, to understand history, to understand society and the world as a non-individual choice. I guess is to say, like, to understand history as a series of structures, as a series of conditions that people arise in, that they swim in like it's water and they're a fish, that is really, really hard for people to see outside of themselves. And so I think oftentimes with the history you get kind of in a popular sense in this society, it's of course that famous great man theory of history we've all heard about.
Yeah.
And a succession of brilliant individuals, men, or today they could be women as well, who have been the real drivers and the real well springs of not just history and society, but societal change. So, of course, a history of the Civil War would be perfect for that, because how many books do we have about Abraham Lincoln and his trials and travails, and how he as this figure sat at this real crux, this linchpin of history? I mean, I don't want to put too strong a point on it, because there is a place for the great man theory of history, right? But the place is at a different level of abstraction from what is valuable for us and for what we need to learn about history. So it's not to say that Lincoln wasn't important. It's only to say that those structures in the history, that subterranean tumult that's going on in the economy, that's going on in society, is way more important of a driver than just great men or the other. I think common way of looking at history is a procession of ideas.
Yeah.
Right, sort of idealist history that would talk about, say, ancient Greece came up with the idea of democracy, and then looking at history and how there was this sort of progressive unfolding of democracy through the world until it got to like the United States, which is the greatest example of democracy. These are the sorts of history that we get normally in our everyday lives, and I think it's insufficient.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking while you were talking about the great man theory, if you had never been to the United States before, let's say you had never been to like the planet Earth before, right?
I
I've heard
wish.
this example used before, right? I fucking wish, right? Hopefully not soon, inshallah, yo. Let the alien comrades come for
That's
real.
what I'm saying.
That ass. But like, I was thinking, man, if you were an alien and you came to Washington D.C. and you saw these monuments, right? If you saw like the Lincoln, monument and like the Statue of Lincoln and all that shit, yo, you would think that our ideals, our culture, and the way we view history has been channeled through like these great individuals, right? These courageous individuals who were brave enough to stand up against the tide of history and shape it, part that shit like Moses parting the Red Seas type of shit.
Right.
But like that's not, obviously, as you've like indicated, right? That's not the case. Like there's a whole like untold masses, like the writhing, the subterranean. That's a perfect adjective for it, right? Forces at work. But there's also like another kind of theory, right, that is more depressing, and we see this from like conservatives especially. And this is like that like nothing ever really changes. That like there's I've even repeated this as a leftist, right? But supposedly attributed to Mark Twain that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Right.
Even that is untrue from Marxist analysis. Can you explain why?
Yeah. The way that conservative and even often liberal intellectuals, if you can call them that, want to understand history, another way is to try to look at this sort of abstract, ahistorical, transhistorical human nature, such as it is, that the best we can ever do is try to constrain the bad parts of human beings, are like our competitiveness, our greed, and our violence, which they argue is like essential to our nature, by forming imperfect but important institutions like democracy, like the free market, and that these institutions arise as a reflection of something that's always true about human beings, of this human nature. That's a very, first of all, I think, wrong way of looking at how people live in society, but it's also a very ahistorical one, because what they point to as human nature is a form of interaction, is a type of social being, is a mode of production, essentially, that's only been around for 200-300 years. But they
Exactly.
want to take this conception of humanity and humans, and they want to thrust it back into the misty trenches of time, whatever you'd want to say. And you see this with the attempt to do economic histories, which are already kind of bullshit, do like economic history of cavemen, where they try to say how much like a stone axe would have cost for this society,
Yeah.
and try to do like a marginal comparison of different, it's completely fucking absurd.
Tens of thousands of years of inflation, right? You just like what you just said, man, reminded me because I'm on Twitter a lot, and I had posted.
Oh, me too.
I know, comrade, shit posted, man, for real, posted more.
We share that burden together.
Not many would, but I saw, I made this tweet about as an aside, but it's related though, about how I wish that leftists were better about talking to Christians about our ideas, right? But that's besides the point. One of the comments I got, though, is the main kind of crux of what I'm getting at, where this person said that when they think of Christianity, they think of capitalism, right? They think of like two together. And like people rightfully commented that, yo, dude, like Christianity predates capitalism by like thousands of years, right?
That's right.
So like, yeah. So again, it's like this conception that there is a fixed nature that people have, that people are naturally greedy, which is you don't have to be an anthropologist to see that like human beings lived in a cooperative sort of way, right, for tens of thousands of years. When resources were scarce, tribes worked together, right, so they could get those resources. And when resources were more abundant, you had more like kind of skirmishes and conflicts and whatnot. All right. So thank you for clearing that up, man, because I think for any person listening to this that has been in an American school, public school especially, right, even at the higher levels, community college or college, it's really frustrating, right, when you have to reconcile the views that you have with the history that you're being taught, right, every fucking day.
Yeah, there's different ways of teaching history, right? There are similarities, like you said, between class societies that existed 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago with what we have today. You can compare those things because they're two different type of class societies. But I've found often what's great about history when I learn it or have the opportunity to talk about it with other people is how frankly bizarre human life and society was at different times in different places through history. It's back to what I was saying with like high schoolers before. There is like this need, this desire to take the way that we live today and the way that we feel, the way we interact with each other, and thrust it back into history and time, when the conversation we're having now would be impossible for people to have 1,000 years ago, not just because of the computer, but just like the words we use and the way that we express ourselves and the concepts that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Democracy, capitalism, these things simply were not there.
These social relations, exactly, which arise from a certain mode of economic production, which we're going to talk about a little later. But all right, so to jump into it, then, historical materialism, man. This was Marx attempting to understand history, but through underlying structures, right? And he used dialectics, right? Could you kind of give a primer on that, Marx's sort of method of understanding history?
Sure. There are people out there, and I'm not one of them, but there are people who subscribe to the hard version of historical materialism, which is to say that the motor of history is only class struggle.
We know. Right? we know, yo. Trust me, you do not hope though. I ain't gonna say no names, but yeah.
Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. Though. We won't. Historical materialism, which is a method, right? It's not a thing, but it's a way of understanding the world that Marx discovered and began and has been continued for 150 years since then. Is not. It shouldn't even be seen as like more right or more wrong than other sort of historical disciplines. Because, like I said, you can learn a lot by reading a biography of Abraham Lincoln. You can learn a lot about the Civil War. But what you can't get at in that instance is really why the Civil War happened. Not just because the South was upset that Lincoln became president, but what was the real division between two different types of capital accumulation, one in the North that was industrial and urbanizing, and one in the South, which was based on slavery and agriculture. The conflict was between both of these systems living inside one government, right? Inside of one state, and that exploding. And when it's a question of, it's not just a question of emphasis, it's getting down to the deepest level of abstraction, where Lincoln's still there, but he ceases to exist as the driver of history. When we get to it, when we get to history at that point, then we're able to not just compare the past to today and see what we're facing. We're also able to see the forms of domination and exploitation that exist within those societies, the kind of class relationships that existed between people, between capitalists and workers, or serfs and lords, or whatever,
Slaves and
that
masters.
slaves and masters,
Yeah.
that cause these conflicts to arise not coincidentally, but necessarily
Mm.
within a conflictual society, within a class society. These conflicts, like the Civil War, are not accidental. In fact, they arise from these deep structures. And it's obviously probably good of us to understand those contradictions.
Yeah, yeah, and I want to get to that with because I want to mention to people too that I'm kind of using the basis of for what we're talking about on this book by Kieran Allen called Marx and the Alternative to Capitalism, which was a book that I found in my community college library when I was first interested in Marxist ideas. Right, like I still considered myself a democratic socialist. Like I was for Bernie. I'm wearing a Bernie shirt now. For those of y'all that can't see, right, but I was
I'm wearing a Trash Future
I
shirt.
know, yo.
Shout out.
I know. Shout out to Trash Future, yo. Future friends of the pod, indeed, man. But I'm using this book, and I think that this part that I want to go over with you when it comes to methodology is really important. And this book is integral to that. I'll put it in the show notes. But the kind of four, I guess, pillars of historical materialism, and I kind of want you to like bounce off and explain these a little more in depth. The first one is that things or events do not occur in isolation, but are part of a web of interconnected relationships constituting a totality, right? Could you explain that idea a little bit of like not looking at these things in isolation, but looking at them as a larger part of something much greater, right?
We, in Capital, right? I got to go back to Capital now.
I've never read
Marx,
it in confession.
Ma- Marx tries to understand capitalist society
Mm.
through what he calls the laws of motion, right? Which is working on a level of abstraction, abstracting away all sorts of like surface phenomena that exist to get to the very essence and the structure of how a capitalist society behaves. It's only by getting there to the most generalized level about conflict between classes and the imperatives of human life, which and the sociality of human beings and the way that that expresses itself, that we can really, I think, ultimately see the forms that that human activity takes and how they change over time. Essentially, it's all about the change over time, right? History isn't about things that happen; it's understanding how the past became the past, how we were brought to the present. If that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense, right? It also like highlights like a second point brought up is that like everything is impermanent, right? Like I'm thinking of a quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, right? And she says that people once thought that the divine right of like kings, right, would last forever, but it didn't. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, capitalism as it exists now is what like a couple hundred years old,
Yeah,
right?
2, 3, 400,
Yeah,
depending on how you measure it.
yeah. So this again, like, kind of goes back to this idea that, like, refuting the idea that conservatives tend to have that things in human nature is like fixed in time, right? And like, what makes them not fixed in time too is you brought this word up before, contradictions,
Mhm.
right? Talk a little bit about the concept of contradiction in a Marxist lens.
Well, you mentioned the word totality before,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
So, if you want to understand a society, say capitalist society, as a totality, you need to see how different people in different times enter into very definite and historically specific social relationships with one another. Especially with capitalism, you're talking about a small group of people who own the means of production, the private property, that useful, productive stuff that helps to make other stuff on the one hand, and the vast mass of humanity who, because they don't own anything, have to work, have to sell their labor power to that small group of people in order to have enough to eat and survive.
Mm.
There's no contradiction of capitalist society through capitalist history that's more fundamental than this one, which dictates how the 8-9 billion people alive on this earth live, whether they're a capitalist or whether they're a worker, right?
Yeah.
Or even how bizarre and strange that social arrangement for making a surplus is in the course of history. Out of this totality of capitalist society, out of those laws of motion, you have two classes of social actors whose interests are in contradiction with one another,
Mm.
but at the same time, and importantly, under this social system, can't survive without each other.
Mm.
So this conflict between this small group that has a lot and the large group of us who has very, very little is not, it's not contingent. It's not accidental. It is structural to that system itself. It is part of the totality. So the totality itself brings out these tensions and conflicts and contradictions within it because it's a conflictual social formation.
Exactly, right. And like I used to work in the kitchen. I used to work in restaurants, right? And I was
I was more of a front of house guy.
you were in front of the house. Yeah, I was back of house. They had me watching
not to lord it over you or nothing. I know there's a lot of tension between the front and back.
There was, but honestly, I just put it on my headphones and washed dishes. I didn't give a fuck, man. I was like,
oh, that sounds awesome.
It was awesome. I used to listen to Antifada, actually. That's actually what I used
Oh,
to do.
beautiful. And meanwhile, I was out there talking to yuppie assholes and trying to upsell them on cocktails.
Oh, I did a lot of that when I was organizing for the Democratic Party. So I feel that struggle. But I try to spit theory to my comrades, even if they weren't Marxists, right? I call my coworkers my comrades. And I would try to sort of from a canvasser, that's what I used to do before that. I would try to explain basic Marxist concepts, but just, people will hear me say this all the time, man, meeting people where they're at. And one of the most effective ways of exposing the contradictions or revealing them to working people who already feel them every day, right, is asking people if they feel like they deserve what they make. And working in the kitchen, I was a dishwasher and one of my coworkers worked the grill. And one day I asked him, I was like, yo, how much are those pancakes that you're making, right? He was like, oh, I don't know. We looked at the menu, it was like $7, right? I was like, how many pancakes do you make an hour, on a Sunday morning when we're it's like brunch and we're packed? He was like, shit, yo. He's like, damn, I make more than 30. And I was like, all right, dude,
you do the math.
you do the math, right? And that's highlighting theft of surplus value, right?
Yep.
And I think that just basic contradiction of when you leave your job during the day and you feel like you got ripped off, it's something that is bubbling and boiling and constantly happening, right? Even if people aren't consciously aware of it, right? It leads to stress in their lives, right? Sometimes it can lead to worse things, right? So yeah, man, I'm happy that you kind of highlighted the engine of all of this, right? Which is these contradictions, right? But there's one more thing too that I kind of want you to help me understand this as well, because
I'll try.
I think it's one of the you've been helping me a lot, because this is a learning experience for me too, so I appreciate it. But this one's a bit more heady for me, man. Another tenet, I guess, of historical materialism is certain features which occur at a lower stage in history may reappear in a more developed form at a higher stage. What does that mean?
Oh, that's good. That's some advanced theory right there. I think
You're doing all the reading for me by explaining this, and I should be doing, so I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm happy to do it, man. I'm unemployed now, so I got all the time in the world.
Yeah, man.
I love this shit. So yeah, one example of that, I guess I'll start with an example is under feudalism, last mode of production, as it were. The way that production was regulated was through the medieval guild system. So you would have basically a closed, like a monopoly on the production of a particular good in a particular area by a bunch of, again, self-regulated artisans who would decide how much it was going to cost, of course, under what conditions was it going to be produced, but importantly, how many other coopers or whatever artisan it is going to be inside the guild and doing that. So they were regulating this internal productive economy. One of the things that you get this from Capital, and this was the real history of it, one of the things you start to see in the late Middle Ages is that guild system started to break down, that the masters who would have journeymen and apprentices underneath them were starting to become capitalists. They were starting to break from that guild system. And instead of having other workers who they brought up and eventually became masters as well, like them, they simply had workers. They became capitalists. And then there's the whole part where the merchants come in and start to interfere, start to ask of the guilds that there be more productive work techniques, demand certain prices or whatever. So the guild and the degradation of the guild is this historical process we can see coming out of feudalism and into capitalism. But, and this gets to your question, it doesn't mean that the remnants of that feudal guild system are gone. Because if you hear what the artisan system was made out of, master, journeyman, and apprentices. This is the same thing that exists in my work in the building trades today. You're a master electrician, you have a journeyman working under you, and they are training apprentices who come up and they work all together
Holy
on one
shit.
job.
Those class relations are still intact despite like the changing mode of production. Yeah. Okay.
They're taking the form that collective production took 3, 4, 500 years ago, and it's updated to a new capitalist reality where you are still a craftsperson, you still have a lot of skills, you're able to dictate in many cases the conditions of your labor, but you no longer control the market yourself. You're no longer deciding what to produce and when. It's the capitalist market that's ultimately dictating the labor market for that. So like this old medieval guild system transforms, if you're a skilled worker under capitalism, into a system that's under attack right now, which is craft labor, right? But the fact that it's even around in the first place nowadays means that there was something about that way of producing under feudalism that translated over into our mode of production and exists on a different, higher level today.
Yeah, man. It just makes me think like the term wage slavery, and especially like as a black person, right? I think like non-commies would hear me say that and they would be like shocked, you know. And Du Bois, by the way, makes a great distinction between chattel slavery, right, and wage slavery, or so-called free labor in Black Reconstruction. But essentially, when you go into if you're working like an hour, you work a wage, right? You go into your job, you don't have any democracy in the workplace. Like you don't have any say over like, you know, how much you make, how much you produce. You might think you can negotiate with your boss about wages, but you try that shit and see how that should work out.
Oh,
You
yeah. Be on your ass in a minute.
Hell yeah,
Even in good times, you'll be out on your ass in a minute. Nowadays, forget about it.
exactly, right? So you just have to like accept whatever wage it is to like, you know, cover your like your necessary labor, your substance, right? Just like what you can do to get to work, get some food, provide for your family, like so you can do it all over again, right?
I want to touch on one thing that you
Please.
reminded me, because you said that only a commie would understand when you talked about wage slavery, what that meant. If you went back in the United States to the 1830s, 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the idea of wage slavery was so commonplace among working class activists and just workers in general in the United States at that time that everybody would know what you're talking about. And that's because the language and the guise that this conflict takes changes over time, to where when we use the term wage slavery, it sounds like aberrant, like you're downplaying chattel slavery in the United States, when it's actually, we're picking it up out of history, a thing that was very commonplace back in this guild system we were talking about, which is that people shouldn't have to slave away at a wage for their entire lives. They should be able to become a master craftsperson and have the freedom of like entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Right?
Yo, that's actually a great segue, man, into talking about the relations of production and the concept of base and superstructure. Right.
Sure.
And I just want to read a quote from Engels. This was in a letter where Marx and him were asked to clarify what they meant by historical materialism. Engels writes, political, juridical, philosophical, religious, literary, artistic, etc. development is based on economic development. But all these react upon one another and also upon the economic basis. It is not that the economic position is the cause, solely active while everything else is only passive effect. There is rather interaction on the basis of economic necessity, which ultimately always asserts itself. So let's dissect that a little bit, right? Because
Yeah.
I think that again, you know, going back to the sort of nothing ever changes, right? Like people think that human nature and culture is fixed and it is isolated, and the economic mode of production that is running parallel, right, with culture, this culture to people is just isolated, it's atomized, right? Talk about the relations of production and base and superstructure a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I mentioned the mode of production, right? The relation of production is that arrangement I talked about before, with a few people who own the means of production and a great mass who owns nothing
Mhm.
and has to work for other people. And it also refers to, under capitalism, and this is an important part I think that some people miss
Mm.
about the lessons that you get from historical materialism. Marx, is the increasing socialization of production.
Mm,
So at the same time as we become more and more individuated, as those old structures, the guild structures break down, we become more and more individual in our selling of our labor power and the consequences for not selling our labor power, as it's no longer like a village to help prop us up. As this happens, at the same time, more and more, the production of things is spread across society in such a vast way that it connects all of us,
mm,
that this chain of production connects all people together, whether we're making it, distributing it, transporting it, selling it, or buying, right?
mm.
We're all part of this dense social network of capitalist production, but we don't realize that we're such an integral part to that because we only see the objects that we buy as separate, as simply appearing in the market,
Yeah.
as something we just choose and buy, not seeing those commodities themselves as part of this intricate whole that we ourselves socially are part of at the same time.
Mm,
Base and superstructure, I don't dwell too much on base and
mm.
superstructure stuff. I'm not not my biggest thing, but I think basically it gets back to what I was talking about with the laws of motion before of capitalism. When you were talking to the coworker and you were telling him like, oh, how many pancakes did you make? How much, how much do they make for it, right?
Mm.
That goes to show that in his situation, in your situation, in our situation, there's certain things that are so basic, so given, so taken for granted that we don't even question them normally in the
Mm,
day to day.
mm.
And those tend to be what's called economic things. And this is the hardest thing. I think when you're critiquing or you're on the level of superstructure of culture and
Mm.
politics and that sort, people can understand that things change because they know that there's a difference between how music was today compared to how it was, 20 years ago or whatever. But that economic shit, as Marx used to call it,
Yeah.
economic shit, is not only over determining for society, but it's also over determined so much of what our individual lives is about.
Mm.
Because I can choose to engage or not engage in a particular cultural activity, but you or I couldn't go out and choose not to engage in wage labor.
Yeah.
We couldn't go out and refuse, say, oh, well, yeah, I don't accept that my boss can boss me, so I'm going to talk back to him at work. You'll be on your ass in a minute, you know.
Yeah.
And these, but multiplied by 9 billion people, are the sort of constraints that exist on human activity in a micro sense. And when you get up to the macro sense of all of society in recent history, you're talking about an inhuman system where people are not free.
Yeah.
For all the talk of freedom we discuss in America, what that means, liberty or whatever. There's a radical unfreedom at the center of that, at the base of society. There is a radical unfreedom. Say what you want about whether you want markets after capitalism or you want like to abolish the value form or whatever. The point is that on a day-to-day basis, things are fucked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like you said, people realize that and they recognize that that base constrains our activity as people.
Yeah, man. That's like I think what we should understand, right? Is that like these systems of production, they constrain like the realization of ideals, right? Like people cannot imagine. It's almost like another book, I'll shout out to people. Maybe you can come back and talk about this, is
Yeah.
Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, right?
Mhm.
It's like he says that he uses the movie Children of Men, another one of my like favorite apocalyptic like dystopian films,
Yeah.
right?
It's a good one.
It's a really good one, man. And he says in the very beginning, he says that even though it's like, this world in which like the human race is doomed because like women can't procreate, there's this cellar of like, I guess fine arts, right?
Mm.
That have been I guess taken from museums and whatnot in the societal collapse. And even then, Mark Fisher says, like referencing that scene, is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Right.
And I'm pretty sure as well, right? Like my ancestors, right, could never imagine, right, that they would be free, let alone the country would be governed by like a black dude. You know what I mean?
Right.
As trash as he was, right? Like just that possibility did not exist within that mode of production and thus those social relations, right?
And when you talk about freedom, right, which is one of these abstract ideals we keep getting back to, right? This overriding compulsion for to take freedom seriously in the United States. Even the freedom that we do have that slaves didn't have, but eventually, they won it, is a distorted freedom. It's a perverted freedom because on the one hand, you are free to go work for whoever you want, right? You're free to go on the labor market and sell your labor to whatever boss will hire you or whatever.
Mm.
But you're also free from the means of subsistence that necessary in order to live a life of freedom that isn't dominated by a capitalist, by a boss,
Exactly.
right? So there's a double freedom there, and those freedoms are in contradiction with one another, right?
Yeah.
You're free to work wherever you want, but you're also free to starve.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't get much more basic than that.
It's coercion, right?
Right.
You're
It's a subtle coercion. This is why we need to demystify this shit,
Mhm.
because just this amorphous idea of freedom, people will buy into it. Yeah, well, I can vote for who I want. I can buy an Apple as opposed to an Android or whatever it is. When at the base, right there down at the base, there's a lack of freedom, an anti-freedom that exists
Yeah.
underneath.
Yeah, I like that anti-freedom and unfreedom, yo. I think those are the perfect ways to describe it, right? Because again, like if you don't go to work, like you have the freedom to starve, you have the freedom to be homeless, you know what I mean?
Yep.
You have the freedom to suffer is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as and that gets to so much of the heart of what's rotten right now in the United States in the era of COVID, in the era of a breakdown of political legitimacy,
Mm.
and also in the midst of an ecological crisis. I like to call this the triple crisis:
Yeah.
social, economic, and political. Right in the middle of this crisis is that when people try to understand what freedom is, they understand it as freedom for individual juridical citizens, right? There's that amazing quote from Anatole France is the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread.
Mm.
This is the freedom that the market gives you, right? Everybody is free and equal under the law, and the rich, illegal for the rich to sleep under a bridge as well. Nothing is more American, nothing is more like Western capitalist than these conceptions of freedom, which without a base underneath of economic freedom, mean nothing, especially in a crisis.
Exactly, right. And the thing is too is that like these modes of production, they exert pressure on like legal and like political structures like contract law, right? Property rights, for
Mm.
example, that like protect and capital and its accumulation, right? These are just like under the law, like I guess like irrelevant of status or rank or anything, like the law is universal. But because of the mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, right? If you don't have like, the economic freedom to accumulate capital and be a capitalist, you don't have political freedom, right?
Oh yeah, who's gonna sign a fucking contract with me, man? I don't have anything.
Yo, we don't fucking need it. You know what I mean? Let's build something new, man. But no, sir.
And then meanwhile, we're on the street.
Yeah, right.
The law is fascinating,
Mm.
right? Because it's another one of these mystifications of the market and of society. That the laws are impartial. That the capitalist bourgeois state merely sets the terms and makes sure nobody cheats on one another with these contracts. But you can see, especially in the last 30, 40 years, that the way that the capital accumulates is based on what's allowed under the law,
Mm.
and what's allowed under the law is dictated by what allows capital to accumulate, right? So all the laws about finance, for example, right? When capitalism last reached a serious wall, and we're at it again, which is in the 1970s with the crisis, there needed to be a new set of international rules and regulations for the accumulation and the spread, the financialization of capital. And so, bit by bit, through the 1970s and into the 80s, you saw the laws change in the United States and across the world to open up the world to capital, to globalize that capital.
Mm.
Not because some capitalist had an idea somewhere like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to go send a bunch of jobs to China? It was because it was necessary at that point for capitalism to continue to financialize and to spread across the globe. And so the laws eventually came by the 90s to reflect that necessity.
Yeah, right. And it's like a positive feedback loop, right?
Right.
Because like the economic mode of production is acting upon like these political and legal like institutions, but then the political and legal institutions are entrenching the mode of production
Right.
and acting upon it as well, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yep,
yeah.
yep. And the most pernicious part of it, I think this gets back down to why historical materialism is important, is because all of this happens to us day in and day out in an invisible fashion.
Mm.
because we never question, like a fish doesn't know what water is, right?
Yeah.
It's just like moving around in the world.
Yeah.
And if you tried to explain to it what water was, it just wouldn't make any sense because it's all around them. It's the same with us and the sort of the ideology, or at least like the ways of thinking, the epistemology of capitalism makes a lot of these very important structures in society invisible to us because we think that's just how it's always been and that's how it's always going to be. And it's only at like a rupture point, at a crisis point, that all of a sudden the veil can fall from people's eyes and they can say, wait, 200,000 people dying of COVID when they didn't have to, 30 million people being evicted. This is normal. This is the way things have to be. No, and it's part of our job to show people how under the surface of normalcy in capitalist society, things have always been fucked up. It's just more people are feeling it now.
Yo, you did a perfect fucking segue, man. Like I like this, yo.
That's what comes from doing like 200 podcast episodes. It's like magically can segue in your brain.
Yeah. so all right, man. Let's end off then on because I was mentioned earlier that I was fascinated with apocalyptic dystopian like literature films because I recognize through that medium that the seeds of destruction, right, were already like embedded within reality itself, but also like renewal. Right. And I'm going to read another quote from Marx. And I promise this is not going to be a show where I'm just going to be reading quotes from dead.
I love it, man. I'm like a fish in water when you do this shit. I love it.
But it's like who can say it best, right? This is Marx when he's explaining what follows as the class relations reach a breaking point, as you were just discussing, right? He says, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with property relations within the framework on which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. Like, I guess then, this is the way I've taken it, right? Is that the only way out is through, right? And it's through kind of solidarity. Talk about like, I guess this is kind of like the culmination of Marxist ideas, right? That the class relations will reach such a point that they'll break, right? And who's going to come through that? Explain that a little bit.
I don't have the quote in front of me, but in Capital Volume 3, Marx talks about capital becoming a barrier to itself, right? Which is to say that this moving, churning social relationship that exists in order to, in a very inhuman or even ahuman way, just produce value that valorizes itself, this internal and infernal machine of capital, right? Eventually reaches the point where everything that it's built is abhorrent to it. That this whole human society built on those foundations has to crumble and something new has to arise, which is a very abstract way of talking about. You're talking about relations of production. It's a way of talking about the crisis that we're in right now.
Yeah.
Which is that you've got hundreds of millions already before the crisis, hundreds of millions of people who are redundant to the system, right? That capital could not use, not because they're bad, but because they're unlucky and because they were not necessary in order for value to self-valorize, to become more value, to make profits, right? These people have already been thrown out of this productive apparatus, sometimes for generations now, and are just surplus. They just live outside of it. They live on rags. They're in the informal black markets, right? They're squatters. In South America or in Africa, living outside big cities, eking out an existence. And more so, there are people in the suburbs of the United States who are either outside the labor force or who are only marginally attached to labor, right? This is the inner tendency of capital to just call it productivity, to become more and more productive, to use more and more automation and more machines, to have to make more value, but ultimately expelling human labor from that workforce. So a way to look at it would be, imagine the 2-3 billion people, maybe more than that, who are being unused right now. I'm using that in scare quotes because I think it's a kind of a gross way of thinking about people,
Yes.
but they're not being utilized within the productive nexus of human relationships now because capital doesn't need them.
Mm.
As more and more people are outside of that, you have to think, what could that 4 billion people be contributing right now
Mm.
to a more just society that didn't have irrational rules that meant that half the people couldn't get fucking jobs,
Mm.
right? This capital has become a barrier to itself. And the social revolution that Marx ultimately calls for or says will be arising, I think is it better come soon, man. I mean, we're reaching some capital, certainly reaching some ecological limits at this point. And yeah, we better start moving on.
Man, that's why like I named this pod "A Time of Monsters," right? It's that Gramsci quote that like it's a rough translation, but the old world is dying and the new one struggles to be born. Right now is the time of monsters, and it's been maddening to try to figure out like what the fuck is going on and how we got here, and like also to try to like, because you and I are like online in this kind of like space, like trying to kind of pierce through the irony and the like nihilism, right? And to try to find like a way out that involves like real solidarity. And I'm gonna have a later episode on this. And part of the struggle, I guess, in the United States is having interracial class solidarity, right? And like we were talking about history earlier. I just want to bring this up to mention this. Is like, as a black radical, like just as an example of like how our history as working people is like lost to us. As a black radical, like I still have to like dig deep, man. Thank God I have the resources. I know where I can look now. But like when I was just starting out, dude, I didn't have any money to buy books online,
100%.
Like I didn't know where to find PDFs. I didn't know libcom.org was a thing, So I went to my like school library, and I was just like looking for books on like Malcolm X, right? On Marcus Garvey. My family's from Jamaica. And finding that history was so hard. It's like buried to us, right? It's like we have no idea that it even exists.
Yeah, I mean that's part of I think I think I'm allowed to be proud of some of the work that I've done, and certainly the work that you're doing now, and that a lot of people on the broader left are doing, which is to popularize something which, as you said, has been very difficult. It's been hidden away in the cloisters of libraries and universities. You could, you know, get a $40,000 a year education from a university and learn some of these things, right? But more and more now, things that seem abstract, right? Historical materialism, things that seem like how could that possibly affect me? I think people are starting to recognize that it is affecting them, that this social world, this totality is deeply affecting them. It's in crisis right now. And I think the project of popular history, alongside the project of popular theory, along, of course, the practice of popular organizing,
Mm.
is the only way that ever get anything, right?
Yeah.
Because because Lord knows if we're reaching that limit, if we're going to be in the city of men moment,
Mhm.
if this triple crisis continues as it is, we damn better be ready, right? We better know what happened in the past so we can intervene in the present. Otherwise, the same mystified forces that ensure that we don't know our own history, whether that's a Black American, whether that's a white worker in Albania, whatever it is, right? Uh, they love it. They love to make sure you don't know what your history is. They love to be sure that you don't know what solidarity is. They love it when Black and white workers are fighting about this, that, or the other thing because it's great,
Yeah.
right? It's great for them, and it's all part and parcel of this process of mystification that history is very guilty of. Popular history in the United States that we need to break from. That we need to have our own organs. We need to have our own institutions. We need to organize ourselves as a class.
Exactly, right. And that's the thing, right? Is the ruling class recognizes themselves as a class, right? With common interests and goals that they orient themselves towards, right? But we don't. And yeah, man, I'm just like thankful that like I'm able to do this project and have people like yourself on to kind of like teach people this history. I don't want to say teach, but to kind of help people, guide people through this history.
Well, I said in the beginning when you were talking about being well read or whatever, I'm serious. Like I didn't I didn't have the brain to like sit down and read Capital by myself. So I got together with like 6, 7, 8, 9 other people, and every week at somebody's apartment with like beer and wine and crackers, we'd
Yeah.
sit around a table and we would read Capital out loud to each other and learning collectively like that. I think helps to square this circle of alienation and mystification.
Yeah.
Because if you have the ability, I know we're in COVID right now, so it could be a Zoom call or whatever.
Mm.
But like if we have the ability to learn collectively, to learn as a group, then hopefully someday soon we'll have the ability to act collectively.
Exactly. And one thing I do want to mention, man, is that there's a big difference between writing and talking about socialism and doing socialism,
Hmm.
right? And I think a big part of that is kind of having this sort of analysis and understanding of history, man. And before we head out, man, before you plug your stuff, I just want to read one more quote from Marx. I feel like we're talking about history
Please,
appropriate.
more and more and more. Marshall.
Yo, today was just White Claws and Marx, man. I tweeted that shit out. Yo, that shit was not a joke.
Yeah, just like the Capital reading group, we should have a show where we just read Capital out loud.
Oh, dude,
Great.
like I haven't even like that shit's sitting on my night table right now. I've like it's been sitting in there for months because usually I try to get up and read a book. So if a book is on my night table, I'm gonna read it. But I've been avoiding that shit, man.
It's tough.
It
Man.
is
That's why we do it together.
This quote, man, from Marx, just to take us out, man, is men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. I think that's
it, man.
I think
That
that's
is
a
it.
tight
That
quote,
is it.
man.
If you want to know what the basic thesis of historical materialism, it is that.
It is that.
It's about specific social action and human activity being conditioned by, not completely by, right, but being conditioned by historical factors that we can only try to break out of, but we have to see them first.
Hell yeah, yo. And we got to do it together, man.
That's right.
Yo, what, like, man, Sean, that was fucking tight, dude. You helped,
man. Thanks.
No, yo, plug some shit, man.
All right.
I know people know you, but plug some shit, please.
Yeah. If people want to check out my work, my ramblings, they can go on twitter.com. I am at as_a_worker, which is a really trolly name I came up with that really makes some people mad, but I think it's great.
Yeah, I love it.
And then other than that, you can check out my podcast, The Antifada, with my co-host Jamie and our producer AP Andy. And we do a weekly show with bonus episodes. I do some side projects with Matt from Chapo. And we have great people like Aaron on every week to talk about the exact same sort of things we just talked about today. It's good. It's good fun.
Hell yeah, yo. And I just want to say again, man, please go check out the Antifada. Like that was one of the more formative, podcasts that I listened to that shaped the way that I view the world. And again, man, I really appreciate you coming on, Sean. That ass.
Only Aaron could see me blush when he said that.
Only I could, yo, Sean. Thank you so much, brother.
Thank you, Aaron.
Hell
It's
yeah.
been a pleasure, man. Anytime.
Hell yeah.